A black businessman, fresh off a major deal that could change his life, steps into an upscale restaurant to celebrate. But within moments, everything changes. A manager, assuming he doesn't belong, publicly questions him, humiliating him in front of an entire dining room. Just 7 minutes later, that same manager is called into the office. His career on the line. What happened next left everyone in shock and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we get into it, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from today. And if this story moves you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. It started as just another ordinary night. The airport had its own kind of rhythm. A cold efficiency that hummed beneath the surface of polite smiles and automated voices. People moved like currents in a river, weaving between terminals, clutching overpriced coffees, dragging their suitcases across waxed floors that reflected nothing back at them. Elijah Brooks stood in line at the check-in counter. His posture straight, his expression calm. He had spent years learning how to carry himself in public spaces. How to take up just enough space to assert his presence, but never so much that he would be seen as a threat. It was a delicate balance, one that every black man who had spent enough time in America understood instinctively. He had just come home from a 3-month work project overseas. A long-awaited break from the quiet but persistent weight that pressed down on him in his own country. There, in another land, he was simply American, not a black man in America. Just American. But now, back in his own country, he could feel the shift. The way the woman at the counter gave him a quick, assessing glance before plastering on the customer service smile. The way the man behind him in line shifted impatiently, as if Elijah's presence alone was delaying his day. The first crack in the polished surface came when he handed over his ticket. "Sir, are you sure you're in the right line?" the woman asked. Her voice was polite, but there was something underneath it. Something practiced. Something that assumed he had made a mistake. Elijah didn't flinch. He had prepared for this moment. He had anticipated it. "Yes, ma'am," he said evenly. "I'm flying first class." She took the ticket from his hand, scanning it as if waiting for it to reveal a lie. When it didn't, her lips pressed together into a thin line. She nodded, forced a smile, and handed it back to him. "All right," she said, her voice clipped. "Enjoy your flight." Elijah took the ticket and stepped forward, feeling the eyes on him. The weight of a judgment that had been passed without a single word. He had done everything right, followed every rule, but still, there was a hesitation, a second guessing of his right to be where he was. And this was only the beginning. Elijah made his way toward security, his ticket still warm between his fingers. He had been here before. Not in this airport, perhaps, but at this moment, the moment where something small, something nearly imperceptible, forced him to brace himself. It was in the way the check-in agent had hesitated, the way she had searched for an error that did not exist. It was not outright hostility. No slurs, no refusal of service, just a seed of doubt planted in the air, watered by years of quiet, unspoken assumptions. He took a deep breath as he approached the security checkpoint. A young white couple in front of him breezed through effortlessly, the woman giggling at something her partner had whispered as they placed their bags on the conveyor belt. No extra looks, no stops, no suspicion. Elijah set his duffel bag down, slipped off his shoes, and walked toward the body scanner. The TSA agent, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, barely looked up before waving him forward. But just as Elijah stepped through, the agent's voice cut through the hum of the airport. "Step aside, sir." Elijah knew better than to react. He turned, calm, measured, and nodded. The agent gestured toward a secondary screening area. A woman, younger, her uniform stiff with newness, moved toward him. "Random selection," she muttered, though there was no real explanation needed. Elijah raised his arms as she patted him down. He didn't complain, didn't resist. He had been here before. But then, she moved to check his bag, unzipping it with a precision that made his stomach tighten. "What exactly are you looking for?" he asked, keeping his voice level. She didn't answer right away. She sifted through his belongings, pausing at his passport before glancing at him. Just routine, she said, but there was something in her eyes. Something that flickered and then disappeared. Routine. That was the word they always used. By the time Elijah was allowed to gather his things, the young couple was long gone, probably sipping overpriced coffee at their gate. He had lost 10 minutes. 10 minutes of his time. His dignity. He slung his bag over his shoulder and walked on. A few steps ahead, a businessman in a sleek suit adjusted his cufflinks, barely noticing Elijah as he strode toward the first-class lounge. Elijah watched him disappear inside. No questions asked. He clenched his jaw and followed. He had paid for his seat. He had earned his place here. But even now, as he stepped into the lounge, he could feel it, unspoken, but present, the sense that he was still being asked to prove something. Elijah stepped into the first-class lounge, adjusting the strap of his duffel bag. The room was quiet, bathed in the golden glow of recessed lighting. The hum of whispered conversations punctuated by the occasional clink of glass. A bartender in a crisp white shirt poured a man a drink at the bar. A woman in a designer suit scrolled through her phone, her luggage parked neatly beside her. Elijah had paid for this space just like everyone else. And yet, as he moved toward a chair near the window, a shift in the air signaled that his presence had not gone unnoticed. It began subtly, the brief pause in conversation from the older couple seated near the fireplace. The sidelong glances from the man flipping through a business magazine. The way the receptionist at the front desk, who had barely looked up for the others, suddenly straightened as if something required her attention. Elijah chose his seat with intention. Setting his bag down beside him, he pulled out his phone, resisting the urge to meet their gazes head-on. He knew how this worked. If he looked at them too directly, too assertively, they would recoil as though he had done something wrong. If he ignored them completely, they would take that as a sign of weakness. The key was in pretending. Pretending not to notice the tension in the air. Pretending not to see the way the bartender glanced at him, as if assessing whether he belonged. It was not new, this particular dance. A flight attendant entered, adjusting her uniform, her hair pulled into a tight, efficient bun. She was middle-aged, poised, her presence commanding in the way only those who had spent decades in the service industry could manage. As she passed by Elijah's seat, her eyes flickered toward him. Just for a moment, and then, she was gone. A moment later, the receptionist appeared beside him. "Sir," she said, her voice laced with a sweetness too deliberate to be genuine. "May I see your boarding pass?" Elijah exhaled slowly. He knew this move. The man at the bar hadn't been asked. Neither had the suited woman still absorbed in her phone. Still, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the neatly folded ticket, and handed it over without a word. The receptionist studied it longer than necessary, her lips pressing together as if searching for an error. Elijah let the silence stretch between them. He had learned, long ago, that silence could be more powerful than words. Finally, she handed the ticket back. "Thank you," she said, offering a tight smile. "Just a routine check." Routine. That word again. Elijah slid the ticket back into his pocket, his face betraying nothing. But inside, something burned. He had thought that first class meant something different. That the price of admission came with a kind of immunity. A reprieve from this kind of treatment. But here, among the plush chairs and complimentary champagne, the game remained the same. Different setting. Same rules. Elijah leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes, listening to the quiet murmur of voices around him. He was tired. But the flight hadn't even begun yet. The flight had yet to take off. And already, the walls of first class seemed to close in around Elijah. He felt it in the deliberate absence of eye contact from the flight attendant as she moved through the cabin. On the way, the older man across the aisle glanced at him. Then at the empty seat beside him, as if expecting someone to correct an error. In the tension simmering beneath the surface, like a pot just on the edge of boiling over. The hum of conversation was polite, restrained. Elijah sat still, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his breath measured. He had learned long ago that to survive moments like these, he had to make himself small. Not physically, but in presence. Then she arrived. The flight attendant, the same one who had stolen a glance at him earlier. Her name tag read Ms. Caldwell. She was older, with a certain kind of bearing. One that came from years of enforcing rules she didn't create but had long since learned to wield. She stopped beside him, a tight-lipped smile forming as she smoothed a non-existent wrinkle on her uniform. "Sir," she began, her voice honeyed but firm. "I just need to confirm your seat assignment." Elijah didn't sigh, didn't frown, didn't even blink. He reached into his pocket, retrieved the ticket. First class, seat 3A, just as it had been an hour ago. She took the slip of paper between her fingers, studying it with an intensity that suggested she was looking for something more than just a confirmation. A mistake, a discrepancy, something that would validate the unease his presence seemed to cause. She found nothing, and still, she hesitated. Elijah could hear it then. The way conversations around them grew quieter. The subtle shifting of bodies leaning in just a little closer, waiting to see how this would play out. Ms. Caldwell returned the ticket to him with a carefully measured nod. "Thank you," she said. "Not apologies for the inconvenience. Not enjoy your flight. Just thank you." She moved on, and Elijah slid the ticket back into his pocket, his fingers pressing into the fabric for just a second too long. He should have been used to this by now. He had been preparing for it his whole life. But that was the thing about injustice. It never came gently, never arrived in a way that allowed you to simply accept it and move on. It came with weight, with heat, with the suffocating knowledge that it would happen again, and again, and again. Elijah exhaled slowly, tilting his head toward the window. Outside, the world was still. Inside, the storm was just beginning. The plane had reached cruising altitude, but Elijah's thoughts remained grounded. A fragile silence had settled over first class, thick with the kind of discomfort that people pretended not to notice. He was not naive enough to believe that the brief exchange with Ms. Caldwell had been the last of it. No, he had seen too much, lived too much, to expect that kind of mercy. He sipped his water, letting the cold spread through his mouth before swallowing. Across the aisle, a woman in pearls and a carefully pressed blazer cleared her throat. She had been glancing his way since the plane took off, her eyes flickering between his seat and the flight attendants, as if waiting for someone to say what she wouldn't. Elijah had seen that expression before. It was not overt hostility, but a quieter, more insidious doubt, the kind that didn't need to be spoken aloud to be understood. A soft rustle of fabric. The man 2 rows ahead turned slightly, just enough to glimpse Elijah over his shoulder. There was something knowing in his gaze. Recognition, perhaps, or something else. Then came the voice, low at first, careful, but deliberate. "Excuse me, miss?" The woman in pearls had turned her attention to a younger flight attendant, one who had been moving efficiently through the aisle, checking on passengers. "Yes, ma'am?" The woman gestured toward Elijah without looking at him directly. "I believe there may have been some kind of mix-up." The words were so smoothly delivered, so expertly disguised as concern, that for a moment, even Elijah felt the sharpness of them only after they had landed. The flight attendant hesitated. "I'm sorry, ma'am. What do you mean?" The woman gave a light, practiced laugh. "I just assumed there might have been an error. I mean, first class usually, well, you understand." Elijah felt the weight of those words settle onto his skin, seeping into the spaces between his ribs. The flight attendant's face tightened, her professionalism momentarily cracking before she recovered. She glanced at Elijah, as if gauging whether to involve him, before carefully straightening. "I assure you, ma'am, all seating assignments are correct." But the woman only smiled again, something smug curling at the edges of her mouth. "Of course, just making sure." Elijah did not react, not when the woman finally met his eyes for the briefest of moments before turning away. Not when a man 2 seats down shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly engrossed in his tablet. Not when Ms. Caldwell reappeared at the front of the cabin, her sharp eyes scanning the space as if she could feel the growing tension but had no intention of addressing it. Instead, he sat still, because that was the expectation. Wasn't it? To endure without protest, to absorb without breaking, to carry the burden of their discomfort so they would never have to feel it themselves. His father's voice echoed in his mind, steady and clear, From years of lessons that had hardened into survival. Don't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Elijah exhaled, slow and controlled. He reached for his book, flipping it open with a deliberate ease, as if nothing had happened at all. Because this was not new. This was America. The tension in the cabin had settled into something quieter, but no less suffocating. Elijah could feel it in the way the air seemed to press heavier against his skin. In the way people shifted in their seats. In the weight of the states that never quite landed directly on him but circled around him like vultures. Waiting. Miss Caldwell had returned to her station near the front. Her posture stiff. Her hands folded neatly in front of her. She had not spoken to him again since their first interaction. But her presence was enough. He knew she was waiting. Calculating. Elijah kept his book open, though he was no longer reading. Sir? The voice came from the aisle. Unfamiliar but firm. He looked up to find a man standing beside him. Tall, dressed in the crisp uniform of an airline security officer. Would you mind coming with me for a moment? The request was delivered smoothly, as if he had been asked to step aside for a minor inconvenience. A simple formality, but there was nothing simple about it. The air around them had already changed. Passengers pausing in their quiet conversations, their eyes flickering between Elijah and the uniformed man. Elijah did not move. Is there an issue? The officer hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. We just need to verify something with your ticket. Shouldn't take long. Elijah felt the heat rise in his chest. It was always this way, wasn't it? The performance of neutrality, the practiced tone that suggested this was just protocol. But he had lived long enough to know better. From the corner of his eye, he saw Miss Caldwell watching. And suddenly, he understood. She hadn't won the first time. Hadn't gotten the satisfaction of forcing him out of his seat on her own authority. So she had done what people like her had always done. Found someone else to do it for her. Someone with a badge. Someone who could escalate the situation just enough to make it impossible for him to remain. Elijah exhaled slowly. He had two choices. He could argue, demand an explanation, and refuse to stand. He could let the confrontation unfold in full view of the cabin, knowing exactly how it would look. Knowing that by the time the story spread through whispers, it would be twisted into something else entirely. A disturbance. A refusal to comply. Or, he could stand, not in surrender, but in something else. Something colder. He closed his book with deliberate ease. His movements slow, controlled. He looked at the officer. Then at Miss Caldwell. Then, finally, at the passengers around him. All of them waiting to see what he would do next. Then he stood. A ripple moved through the cabin. Silent but unmistakable. Elijah did not argue, did not ask questions. He simply adjusted his jacket, picked up his bag, and stepped into the aisle. He did not look back. Not Miss Caldwell. Not the woman in pearls. Not at the passengers who had sat silently through it all. Because he had already seen everything he needed to see. Elijah followed the officer down the narrow aisle. His footsteps steady, unhurried. He wasn't in a rush to meet whatever awaited him on the other side of the cabin door. But he refused to be dragged. If there was one thing he had learned, it was that dignity, once surrendered, was rarely returned. Passengers turned their heads just enough to see, but not enough to be caught looking. Some murmured, their whispers low and conspiratorial. Others kept their eyes on their books, their in-flight magazines, their half-drunk cups of coffee, pretending this wasn't happening, pretending they weren't complicit in their silence. The security officer, his name tag read, M. Townsend, led him past the business class section and toward the front of the plane. Elijah could see Ms. Caldwell now, standing near the cockpit door, her arms folded neatly across her chest. Her expression was poised, neutral, but Elijah knew better. This was the face of someone who had gotten what she wanted. The officer stopped and turned toward him. We just need to verify your seating arrangement, he said, voice flat. My seating arrangement? Elijah asked, his tone measured. Townsend hesitated, shifting slightly on his feet. There was a discrepancy with your ticket. The head flight attendant reported an issue. Elijah smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. There's no issue with my ticket, he said, keeping his voice even. I paid for my seat. I checked in. I boarded without a problem. I sat down where I was assigned. The only issue here is that I am sitting somewhere certain people don't think I belong. Townsend's mouth opened slightly as if to protest. But he said nothing. He knew it too. Elijah didn't look at Ms. Caldwell. He refused to give her that satisfaction. Instead, he turned his gaze toward Townsend, holding it just long enough for discomfort to settle between them. If you want to verify my ticket, you can pull it up in the system. I have nothing to prove to you. Townsend glanced at Ms. Caldwell, as if searching for an escape. We'll just take a look, he said finally. A second flight attendant, a younger woman, blonde, no older than 25, had been standing by, holding a tablet. She fumbled slightly before swiping across the screen. Elijah watched as her eyes flickered, scanning the data in front of her. And then, just as quickly, they widened. There's no issue, she muttered. Townsend frowned. What do you mean? I mean, his ticket is valid, she said. His name, his seat, everything checks out. A silence fell over the space. Elijah let it sit there. Let the weight of it settle over Ms. Caldwell, over Townsend, over everyone who had taken part in this quiet humiliation. He turned then, meeting Caldwell's gaze for the first time. You called security for this? His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. A blade sharpened by decades of experience. Caldwell's lips tightened, her carefully composed mask beginning to crack. She started, but Elijah cut her off. You knew my ticket was valid before I boarded. You checked it. You watched me take my seat. You let me sit there just long enough to make sure I got comfortable before deciding I didn't belong. His voice was still quiet, but it carried. The younger flight attendant shifted awkwardly. Townsend exhaled through his nose, looking away. And Caldwell had nothing to say. Elijah tilted his head slightly. Say it, he challenged. Caldwell's jaw tightened. Elijah stepped forward, just slightly, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. Say why you really did this. She blinked. Once, twice. But she didn't speak. Because she knew she couldn't. Because there was nothing she could say that wouldn't condemn her further. Elijah straightened. Give me back my seat, he said. The younger flight attendant glanced at Townsend. Townsend glanced at Caldwell. Caldwell, silent, stiff, humiliated, nodded once, sharply. And just like that, Elijah turned, walking back toward the first-class cabin, leaving them standing in the wreckage of their own making. Elijah walked back to his seat in first class with a quiet certainty. Not out of arrogance but because he knew what had just taken place wasn't about him alone. It never had been. The air in the cabin had shifted. Passengers who had pretended not to notice now stole sideways glances. Some of them embarrassed. Others silently impressed by the way he had carried himself. A few held their gazes just long enough to acknowledge something unspoken. A quiet solidarity. A shameful recognition of how easily this could have gone another way. He sat down, exhaling slowly, willing his hands to remain steady as he reached for the seatbelt. He wasn't angry. Anger would be too easy. He was exhausted. Exhausted by the weight of expectation. Of having to prove his worth in a place where his money was just as good. Where his presence shouldn't have been a question. Across the cabin, the younger flight attendant, a woman who had been caught between duty and discomfort, kept her head down, pretending to check the flight manifest. But Elijah saw her. He saw the way her fingers trembled slightly on the screen. The way her throat worked as she swallowed hard. She was the type who would go home tonight and tell someone what she had witnessed. She would say, I didn't know what to do. She would say, I should have spoken up. And maybe, just maybe, next time, she would. Ms. Caldwell, on the other hand, had disappeared toward the galley. Elijah didn't need to see her to know she was stewing in the same silence that had protected her for so long. But silence, like anything else, had its limits. And then, just as he was settling back into the flight he had paid for, he heard the intercom click on. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain's voice rang out. Steady, practiced. We'd like to take a moment to thank you for flying with us today. We are committed to ensuring that every passenger receives the dignity and respect they deserve on our flights. A pause, not long enough for most people to notice. But Elijah did. We appreciate your patience. That was it. That was all he said. But it was enough. Elijah felt it ripple through the cabin. The weight of unspoken acknowledgement settling over those who had watched this unfold. Those who had played their roles. Passive or otherwise. The words weren't an apology. But they were something close. Something meant to restore order without admitting what had been broken. A few seats over, a businessman in a tailored suit cleared his throat and nodded toward Elijah. Just slightly. Not a full gesture. Not an apology. But an attempt at recognition. Elijah nodded back, understanding the limitations of men like him. The plane hummed forward, pressing through the sky, steady, unwavering. Elijah let his eyes drift to the window, watching the earth below shrink into abstraction. He had won, if one could call it that. He had reclaimed what was his. But the victory was a hollow one. Because next time, somewhere, on another plane, in another restaurant, in another boardroom, this would happen again. And the next person might not have the patience, the composure, the quiet resistance that allowed Elijah to walk away with his head held high. The next person might lose everything in 7 short minutes. The thought sat heavy in his chest. So he did the only thing he could do. He closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and let the plane carry him home.